Yes, my friends, you have reached it, the epitome of foreign policy success in academics. You're learning about the Cold War. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the beginnings of the Cold War, which pretty much envelops, actually, many could argue that it still envelops U.S. foreign policy and military decisions for the next like 30 years after World War, like 40 years after World War II is over, and even sometimes if you think about current events that are going on with international relations today, also things that are currently happening. Don't let me forget though. Oh my goodness, I forgot. But don't let me forget to post the duck and run video. I wish we could all watch it together because it's one of my favorite things to do. It's this ridiculous public service announcement that the U.S. put out during the Cold War, which basically said that you could save yourself from a nuclear holocaust if you hid underneath a desk. So yeah, that happened. But anyway, let's talk about the Cold War. We'll talk about nuclear weapons, talk about missile crises, probably in the next weeks though, and also just straight up diplomatic intimidation. So I think David Ballard can relate to this one, where you poke your enemy in the chest. If you don't know what I'm talking about, play Twilight Struggle. We got to find an online version. That would be sweet. Anyway, so what is the Cold War and who fought in the Cold War? So generally, the Cold War is thought of as a conflict between the United States on one side and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, or the Soviet Union, or Mother Russia and all of its satellite states right after World War II. So US, Soviet Union, and then a variety of different proxies. So this Cold War is going to play itself out in Korea, in Cuba, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Eastern Europe, in Germany. It's going to play itself out in Latin America. So it's pretty much, I mean, you could think of it as almost like a pseudo Third World War. But why is it called the Cold War? So some people don't understand why they refer to it as that. So there's a couple of reasons for it. One, the US and the Soviet Union never directly engaged each other in military conflict. A lot of it was fought between proxies or just kind of like diplomatic browbeating, as it were. And it also fluctuated over the time period between periods of thaws where the tension kind of was reduced. So you had things like actual cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States, or they would start to reduce their arms, or you had this thing called détente, not détente, détente, where they actually had like a more peaceful relationship over like the late 60s into the 70s. And then you also had what you would call like a deep freeze, where you'd have very tense situations, a lot of suspicion between each other or between themselves. The CIA and the KGB, so these are the groups that would be conducting covert, that's right, I said it, covert operations in different countries on behalf of their government against the other government, and straight up just warfare in general. If you think of a place like Korea, between South Korea and North Korea, or Vietnam, between South Vietnam citizens, North Vietnam. So you have these fluctuating periods of intensity and relative like thawing out of tensions. So the two big objectives for this lesson are to compare and contrast, and mostly you're going to see differences, but compare the economic systems and the political ideologies. So we're talking about how they develop their economies and their resources, and then how their government systems are set up and what they believe is important in terms of government or political systems of the US and the Soviet Union, the post-World War II era, so following World War II, and then analyze and explain. So again, we're looking at, can we think of varying different examples within this category and then draw a direct connection to the issue that we're talking about. So analyze and explain how competing national interests, so the interests after World War II of these two countries, what they were trying to strategically obtain or what their goals were, caused conflict between the two of them in the years following World War II. The other way that I like to think about it sometimes, just in terms of like a more compelling question, is if you were to put some blame on starting the Cold War between these two countries, would you blame the US? Would you blame the Soviet Union? Would you blame both of them? Would you, of course, blame Germany, because that's what everybody likes to blame things on during this time period especially, or somebody else? So things to think about as we go through. Also, if you haven't seen it yet, I have a guided note sheet. Again, not collecting your note sheet, but it might help you keep track so you don't have to go back and look at the slides or look at the video again, because who wants to hear me talk more than once? Certainly not me. All right, so the Cold War, like I was saying earlier, defines U.S. foreign policy. It's dealings with other countries. If you think like when we started the semester, the thing that was defining foreign policy in the U.S. was imperialism, and then it starts to become this more like global leader role during World War I, World War II, and now it's totally focused on the Cold War. So it defines the relationship with other countries, and it's going to envelop the administrations of 8 different presidents before it's finally over, and technically a little bit of a 9th as well. But it starts with, and you can also see you've got the blue and the red. That's right, color blindness, but I can see it. I also just know the political parties. But you've got Democrat and Republican presidents, all kind of, despite being different parties, having the same general outlook how the Cold War is supposed to be handled. So you got Harry Truman starts off after Franklin D. Roosevelt dies during World War II, the last year of World War II. Dwight D. Eisenhower, John Kennedy before his assassination, Lyndon Johnson before he decides not to run for his 2nd term, Richard Nixon before he resigns, Gerald Ford. I don't even have anything good to say about him. Jimmy Carter, and then Ronald Reagan, which kind of ties a bow on the Cold War, pretty much. At that point, it's kind of nearing its end. But we're talking all the way from 1945 to 1988, and then even a little bit further if you go all the way to the end of the Soviet Union. So here's just a couple questions that the U.S. is trying to think about as it goes into the Cold War, and things for you to think about if you try to compare the Cold War with different types of overt war that the U.S. has done throughout time. So what role is the U.S. going to play in the Cold War? Are they going to try to isolate themselves? Are they going to try to really cooperate with other countries? Are they going to stand up for its principles? Or are they going to protect its interests? And this goes back, if you're in my classes, I know we did this at the beginning of 2nd semester, but we talked about the 4 roles for U.S. involvement in the world, and you're going to kind of see that show up again when they're trying to decide. In fact, I have an activity kind of based off of it when they're trying to decide what their policy and their role is going to look like during the Cold War. Also, as with many wars and international conflicts, we try to think about what happens to civil liberties or the people at home. What does the home front look like in fighting this Cold War? And it's going to be very similar to other wars. You're going to see restrictions on civil liberties. You're going to see women taking on men's roles. You're going to see resistance. You're going to see mobilization. You're going to see another Red Scare with McCarthyism, with Joseph McCarthy from Appleton, Wisconsin, where I went to high school. They're not that proud of Joseph McCarthy for being there. But okay. So I'm going to kind of go through, and this is all about comparing. So I'm going to kind of look at what were the different concerns between the two countries in general. These are a little bit oversimplifications for our purposes, but you can get really deep into these things if you look into them a little bit more. But the U.S. big concern is let's not have another World War II, like that, or World War III, if you want to call it that. So they try to look at what do we see in the U.S. as the causes of World War II. Well, the first thing they think about is the Great Depression. So foreign policy experts, policymakers in the U.S., historians, political scientists are thinking if the Great Depression hadn't happened, Hitler probably wouldn't have gotten to power in Germany, Mussolini probably wouldn't have gotten to power in Italy, and Japan probably wouldn't have wanted to expand its empire as much because they could have traded and gotten resources that they wanted if they got along better. Now, many would argue that this doesn't take the place of imperialism, and if imperialism is still happening, you're probably still going to have a war, but that's a whole nother bag of worms. Bag of worms? A can of worms. Don't put worms in your bags. Don't put bags in worms. Neither. Okay. So the other thing they're thinking about is, all right, so how do we prevent worldwide depressions from happening? Well, one thing we can do is we can have more trade. We can have free and open trade and try to promote the economies of other countries. So the way they see it is isolated nations go to war to get resources. So economic growth is really the key to peace. We need to have a global economy that is growing. Not necessarily that everybody's equal, but at least people can get what they need. And if they can't get it in their country, they can trade for it. So that's their big concern. There's another big concern is they think about, okay, well, how do we get this economic growth? Well, they kind of looked inward and they're like, well, what do we do that makes our economy so great? So they decided, hey, free enterprise like capitalism and democracy, where people choose their leaders and their types of governments, create the most stable economies and governments. Therefore, the US's goal during the Cold War is going to be promote two things: free enterprise, as in capitalism, as in free economies for economic growth, and democracy, or at least as we get into this a little bit further, what they see as democracy, which cynics might say is just kind of like as long as the US likes the leader, that's democracy. But trying to promote, people ruling themselves as much as possible, especially in Western Europe. They really had Western Europe in mind at this time because Europe was the war-torn continent after World War II, and it's going to extend to some other places, but you're going to see that the promotion of democracy is a little haphazard as we go through these various regions. So the Soviet Union, and I think sometimes it's, Stalin kind of can be looked at this way, but try to remember that these aren't like comic book villains that we're talking about here. These are nations that have concerns, and their concerns just weren't aligning with the United States, and that's what leads to these kinds of conflicts that lead to war. So anyway, try to think about it in terms of not like who's the good and who's the evil here, but like what are the competing concerns and why are some promoted and others aren't. So Soviet Union's big concern is their own national security. They've been invaded by Germany twice in the last 50 years, and they are kind of sick of that. So what they're trying to look at is how can we geographically create barriers between ourselves and the Germans, and then also, how can we keep Germany weak so that we don't have to worry about them rising up and causing problems. So their national security was a priority, and then they had some economic issues as well. So their form of economy, which we'll go over a little bit later, is communism or socialism. Technically, socialism is an economic system. Communism is something a little bit different. We won't get into that now because I'm already going on 12 minutes and I don't want to bore you with my philosophical whims. But anyway, so they believe that their form of economic policy or their economic system is superior to capitalism, and that they should be encouraging communism to develop in other countries because that's going to benefit to them, not only the other countries, but it's going to affect or benefit the Soviet Union as well because it's easier to work with countries that have similar economic systems to your own. And then also they had this kind of fear that there was going to be this capitalistic uprising throughout the world that was going to try to destroy communism and destroy the Soviet Union, and they wanted to make sure that they could have persuade as many countries to adopt communism as possible to stop that from happening. So what I did is I kind of did a little bit of a comparison, and I wish I could move this, but I can't, which makes it really annoying. So I apologize. But I kind of did a little comparison here of how do these different groups compare, or these countries compare between these categories: their political system, their economic system, how they viewed civil rights in general, inequality, and then religion in the country. So if you think of, here's the two political systems, and I'll kind of explain them a little bit. You don't need to be a expert on either of these necessarily yet, but when you get to 10th grade, you're going to get an understanding of them, government class. But the U.S. is, they say democratic, but technically a republic, electing their own leaders. The people elect the leaders to lead them. So a little more free, open type of political system where the people in general have more power. The USSR has a Marxist-Leninist government, which means they follow the teachings of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, which people say is communist, but really what it ends up becoming is not necessarily how Karl Marx originally envisioned communism being, but more of a totalitarian dictatorship under Lenin and Stalin. So they have a central authority, and that's what's really important here, because when we learned about totalitarianism back during World War II, we're talking about a central authority that makes all the decisions. They just happen to have this ideology, but they were really a totalitarian leadership. And first it starts with Joseph Stalin during the Cold War. Economically, the U.S. actually best can be described as a mixed economic system, but we tend to think of it as capitalist. So if you think of what the characteristics of capitalism are, if you haven't thought about it a lot, you're really thinking about who makes the decisions and how are resources distributed. So people, generally private groups, business owners, consumers, make most of the decisions in an economy because it's controlled by this like omnipresent thing that we call the market. So the market will make the decision over who wants what, who gets what, prices will determine who's willing to buy things and how much they are willing to buy. So production distribution of the resources is determined by individual producers and consumers, also known as the market. So people make their own decisions. It's like the democracy of economics. You're like free to kind of make your own decisions to the point that you have access to resources. And again, a lot of this stuff is oversimplified. I'm not trying to get into economic philosophy here. Too much coffee. Anyway, very little government control, although there is still some government control of the economy in the United States, especially during this time. The government was actually doing a lot of stuff to help the economy. Communistic or communism, also as in an economic sense known as socialism, everything is pretty much controlled by a central group. So in this case, it's the government. So production, distribution is controlled by the government. The government decides how much is going to be produced, who's going to get that stuff, what it is that's going to be produced, and there isn't any privately controlled capital. What we mean by that is property that is owned for business purposes in a communist economy is technically owned by what's called the collective, or everybody. And in this case, it's kind of the government owns it because they're saying we're operating on everybody's interest. So we're going to say we own it, but we're technically the people, which is kind of bizarre because the people didn't really elect the government in the Soviet Union, but that is a whole big thing. Civil rights. Now, this isn't necessarily like tied to communism directly, okay? You're going to see a lot of like issues with, I'm not trying to be a communist sympathizer, but a lot of this stuff that we're going to see in civil rights is going to be because of this more so than this. So the fact that they had a totalitarian government, which tends to happen in communist countries, but that's the reasoning. So the U.S. has constitutional guarantees of a variety of different rights, including freedom of speech and freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, the right to bear arms, right against unlawful search and seizure. Did I say freedom of religion? Freedom of religion. And again, during this time, we're talking the 40s and 50s, there's a lot of groups in society that are not feeling those constitutional freedoms, especially African Americans, but they are technically there. In the Soviet Union, you have a lot of government censorship and a lot of limits placed on personal rights and freedoms. You're actually technically, China has a communist government in that the Communist Party today has power over China. They don't have a communist economy anymore, but they have a communist government, and there's a ton of censorship. In fact, you can even see it with the coronavirus. Granted, when I'm taping this right now, it's not exactly completely known how much was covered up, but they were covering up and censoring information about the outbreak of the pandemic, and part of that is kind of built in endemically into this type of government. Think about inequality. Actually, because of the capitalist system, you do have a lot of social classes. At different points in history, they're more rigid than others, but you have large inequalities in wealth and income. There are some very, very rich people in American society, some very, very poor people, and then there's people in the middle. Over time, the middle is kind of decreasing, but that's generally the idea, is that you have this like social ladder. In the Soviet Union, wealth and income are much more evenly distributed amongst people because the government kind of takes control of redistributing wealth. That can lead to, and did lead to, in the case of the Soviet Union, issues of everybody kind of being in poverty, and that's an issue that comes up as well. The U.S. has had no official religion, but Christianity was most widely practiced. They technically have, within the First Amendment, freedom of religion. The Soviet Union was actually officially an atheist country. They did not have an official religion, and actually their official religion was not having religion, not believing in religion. And actually that is the reason why under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in the 1950s because Dwight D. Eisenhower believed that we needed to separate ourselves from the godless communists and demonstrate that we're a Christian theistic nation. So anyway, little bit of information for you. Also, to put them together, both countries are very large, have very large populations, they have lots of natural resources, and they have pretty well developed economies and militaries. So even though this might not seem like it's a great idea, and especially in like today's parlance, we usually have a negative connotation with communists, the economy of the Soviet Union was doing really well, mostly because of the totalitarian rule that was suppressing everyone else's rights in order to build the economy. But they had a good economy. U.S. had a good economy. Both have very, very large militaries. Both big leaders during World War II on the Allied side. So, if you want to just kind of have like a brief overview, I've got this slide that kind of breaks them down. I also have a cow analogy. So in capitalism, if you think this is a dad joke, that's fine. But sometimes it helps. In capitalism, you can think about it like owning cows. You can have a cow, you can get milk from the cow, you can sell that cow, maybe it's from Wisconsin, I don't know. And you can use that money to buy more cows, you sell their milk, you get profit, and you might not particularly care if your neighbor has any cows or not. They might be in a different social class than you, they might have tons of cows, they might not have any cows, you don't really care. In communism, if you have a cow, everyone in your community shares the milk equally, and technically they all collectively own that cow. And then my little joke in Soviet communism is you have a cow, the government takes all the milk and shoots you. I said it with a stone cold face. Here's the leaders in 1946. You got Harry S. Truman, who's U.S. democracy, and then you've got Joseph Stalin, who's totalitarian. You can see there's a story behind that newspaper he was holding, but we'll get to that later, I guess. So what's the big deal? How did they go from being allies during World War II to being stark enemies for the next like 50 years, 40, 50 years? So once both the U.S. and the USSR were attacked by Germany, they kind of joined together because they had a common enemy and it was going to play down their tensions. They weren't always like super great friends. You can go all the way back to World War I, where the U.S. was actually actively trying to stop the communist uprising in Russia during the Russian Civil War. Near the end of the war, the relationship starts to unravel. So there's unravel. So there's a few things that were going on during that time. First, the USSR, if you remember back in World War II, they were begging the US and the European allies to open up a second front in Europe, which eventually happened during D-Day. But for a long time, they were asking for that. They were losing men every day, getting killed. They by far had the most casualties in the war, and it took a long time for the other allies to open up the second front, which upset the Soviet Union. They felt like they were holding out on them. Also after the war, because the U.S. had those security interests, they wanted to maintain control over Poland and the other Eastern European countries after the war, and that was seen to the U.S. from their perspective as a sign of aggression. From the Soviets' perspective, they were thinking more of it as a security measure, so there was some tension there as well. The Soviet Union wanted more aid to rebuild their economy from the U.S. The USSR also wanted reparations from Germany that the U.S. was reluctant to approve. So most of the allies trying to learn their lesson and not punish Germany again and have a whole bunch of reparations payments. The Soviet Union wanted that. They wanted to get paid back for what they had lost, and they also felt like the U.S. was unfairly underpaying or under-aiding the Soviet Union as opposed to the other countries that they're allied with. Also, the Soviet Union, again, because of their kind of suspicion of capitalists trying to overthrow all the communist countries, they were kind of worried about these two new organizations. One was called the UN, the United Nations, and the second one, which the Soviet Union was part of, and the other one was the World Bank, which was supposed to facilitate trade and money exchange throughout the world. And they felt like these were agents of capitalism, and they were set out to take control over the world and try to marginalize the Soviet Union and its allies. And then you got the atomic bomb as well. You've got this arms race. You've got nuclear warfare is now a reality, and it's straight up disturbed the Soviet Union. Also, because it ended the war in Japan before the Soviets could really get involved, the Soviets weren't able to get any territory from Japan. The U.S. could kind of claim that they ended the war. So there's a lot of tension that way as well. So here's where we're kind of looking at tensions begin to rise, and I promise I'm going to keep this right around 30 minutes. I won't go too much over 30 minutes. I'll go more quickly if I have to. So these two organizations that form, the first one, if you follow politics today, is pretty common to hear about, is NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this was a military alliance of many of the Western nations. So by Western, we basically are talking about like West Germany, West, so like Britain, France, the US, Canada, eventually more Eastern nations join as well. But they basically, for simplified purposes, all pledge to have each other's back. If you attack, Article 5 of the NATO Charter says if you attack one group or one country, you attack them all. And this has only actually been used once, ever. And that was in 2001. The US asked NATO to invoke it on its behalf because of the September 11th terrorist attacks. So that's the only time it's ever been used, but it's there as a kind of a method to try to keep peace by having so much strength in a group. So in retaliation, in response, the Soviet Union started its own little group club, and they called it the Warsaw Pact, and that was a military agreement among communist East European nations. So I've got the map here that shows you've got these, I'm colorblind, dark blue, purple, NATO countries. You also have other US allies that weren't necessarily part of NATO at the time, or NATO allies. Then you have the Warsaw Pact, which again you can see is mostly Soviet Union, some Eastern countries. And then you have areas that have, China goes back and forth. They call it playing the China card. They're not in NATO, they're not in the Warsaw Pact, but they're kind of allies with whoever they think is going to benefit them the most. But you also have areas where you have this guerrilla warfare going on, where you have covert operations trying to cause problems and overthrow various governments, both on the communist side and the anti-communist US backed side as well. I'll leave that for you to check out a little bit. So last thing before I stop, China, hugely important, especially in today's global geopolitical sphere. So for nearly 2 decades at this time, China had been having a civil war basically between its communists and the government, the nationalistic government of China. And the US sent $3 billion in aid to the Chinese national government leader, Chiang Kai-shek, from 1945 to 1949 to try to help them fight against the communists that were trying to overthrow the government. So here's the two leaders. You've got the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek, and then you've got the communists on the other side, and their leader is Mao Zedong. He's right there. He becomes Chairman Mao later on, and we'll get to that in a second. So basically the results were in 1949, the government of China, the nationalist government, fled to Taiwan and started their own kind of like government in Taiwan, and that's caused a lot of consternation. It was even in the news recently about the World Health Organization, how Taiwan wants to be considered its own country, but China doesn't want to. They feel like Taiwan is this like kind of like warring insurrection against China. So anyway, when Taiwan is in the Olympics, they have to be called Chinese Taipei because that makes the Chinese happier. Basically, I probably oversimplified that a little bit, but that happens. So the nationalist government fled to Taiwan. The communists took over mainland China. They renamed China the People's Republic of China, which is what it is today, Communist China. And the US, for a long time, refused to recognize that government. They said, for all intents and purposes, Taiwan is the real China for us, and China is no longer China. It's just Communist China. So that happens, and that's a big deal because you've got another up-and-coming nation, another very large nation building up its military that is communist. And luckily for them, for the US, the Soviet Union and China never really got like along really well because that could have been a huge deal. But two large communistic countries going on after World War II. So I'm going to stop this now, but this leads us to how the US is thinking, how are we going to conduct our Cold War policy in terms of our relationship with the world? Are we going to be really involved? Are we going to go back to normalcy like after World War I? Or are we going to try to continue to be a global leader? What's that going to look like? So in a separate video, I'm going to go over this situation of the crisis in the Mediterranean. What you're going to get to do is kind of decide how would you develop, what policy options do you think are the best? Would you adopt just one? Would you use different ones in different situations? And then we'll kind of go over the thought process of the United States and what the upsides and downsides were of those policies. So in a separate video, I'm going to go over the situation, but there's going to be 4 policy options that policymakers had to choose from during that time. And what I'm going to have is some handouts for you to read on each policy option, like theme, and then you're going to have to consider which one you would support if you were facing that situation in the 1940s, 50s. So what do you see as some, and there's going to be some information about arguments for and against, but what are the upsides and drawbacks of these different policies? Do you think the U.S. should have gone with a different one than they did? And then as we go through kind of more of the Cold War stuff in the next couple of weeks, try to start thinking back to that. And for my kids, when we did that activity at the beginning of the semester, we'll try to think about how that fits into that situation, or those philosophies as well. All right, so we're at 30 minutes. Thank you for listening to all of that. But we'll come back. I'll come back. The next thing will be me describing the crisis in the Mediterranean and you developing your Cold War policy. All right, people. So peace is the word. Stay safe. Get some fresh air, but social distance. And that's about it.